introduce the co-owner of the store, Bert Dykesler, who's sitting back there. Bert, take a hand. I'm Darryl Holter. Bert, so those of you who don't know, and Leslie Swain is with us too, Judge Leslie with Bert, there she is. Some of you may not know the story of Bert and I in the store. 5 years ago, we were walking down Larchmont and we ran into each other and we said, "Hi, what are you doing?" And one of us said, "I'm going over to the store to buy a book." And the other one said, "Yeah, but they don't really have many books like they used to. The inventory is really down." "Yeah, carpeting is bad. It looks good. It looks like the whole store is going down the tubes." "Yeah." Then one of us said, "Well, maybe we should buy it." And the other said, "Are you crazy?" But then, actually, one of us, or both of us, decided that maybe we should buy it. And we still don't remember who first said it. I told the story so many times. Bert, do you know who first said it? We don't know. So we don't know. We have to plead the fifth. We don't know. So
thank God you did.
So we did buy the store, and you know, we did all the things we needed to do to bring it back up to speed, which was, you know, not insignificant. We were told at the time that the store owed $25,000, which wasn't exactly right, and we did put everything in order and put it all together. We have had, as in everybody else in the world, I guess, a difficult year with COVID. We also had a difficult year in the sense that we were across the street in a place that was, the property was, you know, purchased by someone who needed to do all of that work that's going across the street, and we needed to find another place. So we did move across the street, and we had to think a lot about it. And we are here. We're very happy with our new space. We hope you like it. People seem to respond very positively to us, and that's been very good. You know, we're very conscious of our role in the community. We know that independent bookstores can play a great role, and we want to do that. We're very close to the community. We hear a lot from the people that love our bookstore and love being here. We strongly encourage people to make sure that they purchase books here and keep us alive, keep us going. We think that we're kind of part of the intellectual infrastructure of Los Angeles, and we hope you feel the same. We're not like a bridge. We're not like the kind of thing that you can say this is a cost-benefit analysis of it, but we do think we play that role. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight to hear Jon and our presentation. For me, you know, reading the first two-thirds of Jon's book from 1962 with Bob Dylan to 1973 with the Rolling Stones in Exile on Main Street was a little bit like re-walking through my own musical life during those same periods of time. And what we were seeing in the country with respect to changes in music and politics and culture. But Jon and I were born in the same year, so when Jon was in prep school back east, and I was in Minneapolis, Jon was taking a bus to Cambridge, Massachusetts to listen to people like Joan Baez and Tom Rush and Bob Dylan play at Club 47. I was in Minneapolis hitchhiking over to the Scholar Coffee House to listen to John Kerner and Dave Ray and Tony Glover. And these were the people who a year earlier had taught a young guy named Bob Zimmerman how to learn about Woody Guthrie and how to do folk music. So it was interesting. You know, our paths, Jon's and my paths crossed in sort of strange ways in this early period. Jon's lived an incredible life with six careers, and we're so glad, and his latest being an author, and this is his second book. We're so glad that he could join us. And Jon's going to start by talking doing a little reading from the book, and then I've got a few questions for him.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to just start from the kind of beginning of this story, and just to set the stage, I'd gotten out of high school and I was on my way to Princeton University. It's the summer of 1965, and I was a huge Bob Dylan fan, and I was determined to go to the Newport Folk Festival. And fortunately, my older brother knew a friend named Paul Clayton, who was an ethnomusicologist who was close to Bob Dylan. And so he got me a backstage pass at Newport. And then introduced me to a band called the Jim Kweskin Jug Band, which was managed by a guy named Albert Grossman. And Albert Grossman also managed Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul and Mary, Odetta, most of the important people in the folk music business. So Albert hired me to be a weekend road manager for the Jug Band, and that's how this starts. Strapped to a Fender Stratocaster electric guitar, Bob Dylan launched into the opening chords of Maggie's Farm almost before the band was ready. The Newport Folk Festival of 1965 was going to close with a commotion. I had just turned 18 and was an apprentice road manager for Dylan's manager. The explosive moment launched me on a musical journey, one beyond anything I could have imagined at the time. I was standing in the stage wing, transfixed, 10 feet from the band. Mike Bloomfield, acting like band leader, brought his Butterfield Blues Band rhythm section, drummer Sam Lay and bassist Jerome Arnold, into some approximation of sync with Dylan's rhythm. Al Cooper, in a loud polka dot shirt, hunched over the Hammond organ and did his best to fill in the spaces, but it wasn't starting well. I ran out to the mixing booth in front of the stage where Peter Yarrow had commandeered the board. It was worse out front. In his nervousness, Bloomfield kept raising his guitar volume as now drowning out everything else. The first tune ended on a sour note, and there was only light applause from the audience. I gazed behind me, and a look of shock seemed to be the dominant motion in the 20,000 seats of blue work shirts and peasant blouses. The man in the tight pants, orange shirt, dark glasses, and black leather jacket was not their Bob Dylan. What was going on? A chorus of boos filled the air before Bob started his radio hit, Like a Rolling Stone. But by the end, the fans were still booing. Voices from the crowd called for their favorite tunes from the folk era. The band looked nervous, but without a word to the audience, Bob plunged into It Takes a Lot to Laugh, It Takes a Train to Cry. The band found their groove, but when the tune ended, the booing got worse. Dylan turned to Bloomfield and said, "Let's split." To the surprise of the other musicians and the road crew, he unplugged his Fender and walked off the stage. Instantly, the crowd went silent. People started yelling at each other in the aisle. "Look what you did! He's gone, asshole!" Peter Yarrow bolted from the mixing console, and I followed him backstage. Dylan was sitting on the bottom steps of the stairway, heading up to the stage. He was clearly shaken, rubbing his eyes. Peter ran up to the stage and seized the microphone. "Hey, show Bobby that you love him. Let's get him back." The audience roared approval. Dylan sat still on the steps. The audience began to clap in rhythm. Dylan refused to budge. Peter appeared at the top of the stairs, pleading with him to return. Johnny Cash wandered out of the artist's tent, holding an acoustic guitar. For a minute, he watched the triangular drama of Peter, Bob, and the crowd. He moved over to Bob and handed him the guitar. "Play them a song, son." Bob took the guitar and slowly walked up the 30 steps to the stage. When he appeared in the lone spotlight holding the acoustic guitar, the cheers from the audience were deafening. He leaned towards the microphone and, raising his harmonica holder, said, "Does anyone have a D harmonica?" Out of the crowd, 3 of Hohner's finest sailed through the air onto the stage. Dylan danced out of the way and, grinning, picked up one and placed it in the holder. He started to strum the guitar and sing, "It's All Over Now, Baby Blue." When he finished the song, he rushed through Mr. Tambourine Man, then turned and without a word walked quietly off the stage. He had said his piece. They did not own him, and like a lover leaving a bad relationship breakup, he would not turn back.
Yeah, great description of that, Dylan Goes Electric. And it was really a dramatic moment for everyone as we were kind of keep track of these things. And Dylan used that trick about, does anyone have a D harp? Quite frequently, and people would throw them up to him, so he probably collected a lot of honors that way. And It's All Over Now, Baby Blue was a really appropriate song for him to play at that time. So I think a good place to start, John, is really about this folk music scene. I mean, you and I were the same age, and I was really influenced by it, but why do you think you and I and so many other people were really influenced by this movement at this particular time?
Well, first thing, if you think about what was on the radio, pop music at the time, it was Frankie Avalon, Fabian, Bobby Darin. It was not stuff that I could have any feeling for, you know, and quite frankly, you know, Frankie Avalon was selling millions of records, and Bob Dylan's first record sold 4,000 copies.
Right.
And yet, here we are 60 years later, and who do we remember, you know? And so, oftentimes, you know, countercultures start in a place where nobody's listening. And, you know, I go down to Nashville every September to spend time with some people, what's called Americana music, which is kind of, to me, the new folk music. You know, it's Sturgill Simpson and Rhiannon Giddens and those people. And they're not selling a huge number of records, but they're making really good, authentic music that feels real. And that's what it was about Club 47 for me in 1963 and 64. It was astonishing, real music, and some of it was real in the sense of Mississippi John Hurt, who was 70 years old and was playing a blues song that he had originally played in 1926, and then he had disappeared. I mean, he was, when they found him, he was a porter in a hotel making $2 a day, you know, and now he was playing for $500 a night in folk clubs. And so his life had been changed because a few young people went down on these missions like detectives to look for the real blues. You know, so I mean, it was an astonishing time, and the other thing that was happening was that the music and the politics were completely married. In other words, if you were as deeply involved in the civil rights movement as I was a member of a thing called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you listened to Bob Dylan because he would go down to Greenwood, Mississippi to help organize voter drives, sing at a rally to raise some money to organize voter drives. And that was not an easy gig, you know. I mean, quite frankly, when he went down there in 63, a year later, in that same town, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were killed in that same town for doing the same thing that he and a few other people were trying to do. And so it took a certain amount of commitment, but it was pretty tight in terms of your belief in the politics and your belief in the music. And somehow it worked together in ways that sometimes I feel that's missing, you know, today.
Yeah, I think that the attraction to the folk music was, and you mentioned the term authentic, which is sometimes overused to describe it, but I think there was a real search. People were searching for music that was more authentic, and they were going back in time, looking at older musicians and older composers, and finding stuff from other parts of the country that they didn't know about, going into rural areas. And so I think that was all kind of part of the whole thing. And then I also think that it became joined with this political activism. And then that gave it a particular combination of things, which was very powerful. And that's partly why many of the people who went to the Newport were upset with Dylan for going in this direction. And so that became
I think
big
that's
debate.
I think it's a good point.
Yeah.
That look, the reaction of the crowd to Dylan playing electric seemed to me like a little outrageous, you know. I mean, he'd already had Like a Rolling Stone on the radio. It was like number 6 on the hit parade. It wasn't like anyone didn't know he was playing electric music. But these people believed that Bob was their poet of protest, and that was his role, was to sing "The Times They Are Changing." And when he didn't want to sing that pissed them off. Yeah. But it wasn't just Newport Folk Festival, because as you know, as those of you who've read the book and those of you who haven't will find out, I went to work after I got out of Princeton for the band, right? And the band had been Bob's backup group. They were called Levon and the Hawks. And he hired them literally a month after Newport to be his permanent band. And they went around the world, not only all through the United States, but they went to England and Germany and France and Italy and Australia and wherever you can imagine, and they got booed everywhere for the same kind of thing. There's a recording you can buy of Dylan in Manchester in England, where you're hearing people yelling, "Judas, Judas," you know, and you know, like that he had betrayed them. He had left them behind. And somehow this sense of ownership that they had for him, that their right to tell him what he should sing, was something that he didn't give a fig about. Right. And he had enough courage to say, "I love this music we're making." And if you listen to it now, what Dylan and the band were doing was amazing. I mean, fabulous, savage, pre-punk, whatever you can imagine, music. And yet, it got rejected everywhere, and he didn't stop. He once told Robbie, he said, "Don't stop playing no matter what happens." Yeah. And people would come up on the stage and trying to unplug the instruments. And Robbie said he felt like his Telecaster was like he was battling them off with his guitar.
You know, it's interesting, one of the things that you wrote really struck me, and you talked about the fact that when we were 18 years old, you and I, and we listened to some of Bob Dylan's lyrics, we were very much involved in the civil rights and that movement. But we didn't really know what he meant when he said in his song called "My Back Pages," but I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. And I remember wondering, what the hell does he mean exactly? It didn't sound right. But you figured it out, and I think I figured it out later on. But how did you interpret it, John?
So, you know, that's a line that I think a lot of young people today should think about too, you know? Because I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now, to me means, well, when I was 22, I thought I knew everything. I thought I understood exactly what the fuck the world was about. But now, I'm not so sure, you know, and so it's the kind of reverse of what you would think of wisdom and knowledge. It's like, and I find that myself, as you get older, you're not as, you know, just absolutely positive you know what the story is, you know? And, you know, partially part of our cultural problem right now is too many people think they know all the answers and are telling people what they can and cannot say, and that's right. Sad, you know?
Yes, and I think that was really important. Dylan was very, very, did not want to be viewed as a spokesperson of the generation. He hated that. And the more you talked about it, the more he went the other way. Dylan was very, you know, if you look at these press conferences that he had, it was just awful. He was brutal. And he would talk about things about himself that was totally not true at all.
Right.
But he didn't care.
He'd just make up stuff.
He would just make up things, and
Yeah.
he would make up another story, and it didn't bother him.
Yeah.
But, you know, he had transformed himself from Bobby Zimmerman into Bob Dylan, so
Right.
he already had done it once, and he knew how to do it. So, one of the, I thought it was interesting in your book, continuing a little bit about Dylan, but Dylan and the Beatles was kind of an interesting kind of thing, and you had personal experiences with these kinds of relationships. I thought when I first heard the Beatles, and the first, you know, what was it, I Want to Hold Your Hand was the first, and when I first heard the first Bob Dylan album, which you referred to, the self-titled album, which only included 2 of Bob's only songs, the rest of it were other folk songs. But when I first thought of the first Beatles album and the first Dylan album, I would say those things are worlds apart. But after the Beatles and Dylan met, and I think they smoked dope together, but they did other things, I suppose. But the point is, I felt that although Dylan's music was changing, and I understood that, I could see that change, but the Beatles really took a Dylan-esque direction,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's very interesting synthesis. So, Bob has a new song which you've all heard, which is Murder Most Foul, which is this long 20-minute song about the Kennedy assassination. And one of the lines is that the Beatles are coming, they're going to hold your hand. In other words, we were, you know, I mean, obviously, John Kennedy getting killed affected people of my age astonishingly hard. And I went to school with Jackie's half-brother. And so it was like really personal. And so we went into kind of a mourning period. So that happened in November '63.
Yeah.
And the Beatles showed up in February and went on the Ed Sullivan Show. And it was like the official end of the mourning period. Okay, you can enjoy yourself again, or you can have a feeling of joy. And Bob Newirth, who was the person who worked for Bob before I did, told me that Bob toured England in May of '64, and then there's that famous stuff from
The film.
that Pennybaker
Don't
did.
Look Back.
Yeah, and so the part that's not on film is, of course, that he had a suite in the Savoy Hotel, and if you've ever been in London, the Savoy Hotel looks out over the Thames River, and it's really beautiful kind of setting. And John Lennon used to come literally every night to smoke hash and play music. And if you think about the distance from I Want to Hold Your Hand, 1962, Norwegian Wood, it's only like 14 months. And it's like a complete transformation of him as an artist. But on the other hand, the difference from Bob singing Times They Are Changing to like a Rolling Stone is a similar short period of time, and yet completely. I mean, he came back from London and started dressing like a Beatle. Everybody in the office, and what the fuck? He's got these peg pants and these.
He used to dress like Woody Guthrie.
These shoes with really high heels on them, and you know, he's got these ridiculous shirts of weird colors and stuff like that. So I mean. So there was just a cross-pollinization there that went both ways, and they both learned from each other a lot.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You mentioned Norwegian Wood, and it's really interesting because Bob Dylan's song "Fourth Time Around" essentially has the same melody. When she said, "Don't lie, your words just lied," I cried she was dead. So it's the same kind of melody, kind of a similar story, not exactly the same.
Right.
And the question is, which one came first? And Norwegian Wood actually came out earlier.
So folk singers would say it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right? In other words,
Right.
part of the tradition is you borrow
Exactly.
stuff from everybody's sharing.
And that's Dylan's.
You know, I mean, on the very first record he made, he does a song called Baby Let Me Follow You Down, and he starts telling the story that he learned this song from Eric von Schmidt. Right? And so that tradition of 2 a.m. in the morning, everybody trading songs and learning new tunes, that was part of the deal. And then, of course, Clayton told me that Bob blatantly took this tune from Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, from some old Appalachian tune that he had recorded from some people, you know.
Well, Dylan always did that. I mean, he openly talks about it in his speech that he gave to the Mike Harris thing at the Grammy Museum.
That's such a great speech.
He gave a great speech, and he talked about it, and he said, and I can't even remember exactly what he said, but, you know, he said, you can understand why I sang A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall.
Right.
Because I knew, and I can't remember the first one that he knew that he got that from, but it was very characteristic. Yeah. But this trading of songs was always part of the old movement. Right. One of the things that comes up in your book, John, with all your interactions with so many of these rock bands, is that the fragility of many of them. You know, they come and they rise to the top, and then they kind of collapse. And what George Harrison told you, I thought was a good quote. He said, "Bands are hard to keep going after the first magic years wear off, and it becomes a job." And I think maybe that is kind of the story. What do you think? But why is it that some bands like U2 and even the Stones are able to kind of keep going no matter what?
Well, you know, I mean, I have a friend here in the audience who's been in a few bands, right? I mean, you think about the ego involved in creating stuff. I mean, can you imagine if Pablo Picasso was told he had to be in a band? You know, well, there are 4 other guys who can tell you that's not ready to paint. You know, I mean, you'd flip out. You wouldn't do it. So it's hard, you know, when you think you know what's going on, and you're just the drummer, sit down and shut up, you know. So how bands can keep together is hard. I mean, you know, I worked for George Harrison when I did the concert of Bangladesh, and at that point, the Beatles had basically fallen apart completely. And part of the reason was that John and Paul would only allow George 2 songs on any album. In other words, and when he finally did his own album, he did a double album. He had so many songs that he'd written that he'd never been able to record.
So he had written those were long.
Well, some of them he had written long before.
Yeah, I didn't.
But they had this rule that they got 8 songs and he got 2.
Yeah,
or they got 10 songs and he got 2. And that was it. And so that was frustrating for him. And I always said to him, well, why can't you keep the Beatles together and still do your own solo stuff? And for some reason, you know, John was pissed at Paul, and it's all that stuff. But look, it's hard. And the reason the Stones are together, money. I mean, let's be obvious. I mean, you know, Don Henley and Glenn Frey hated each other. But when the Eagles' Greatest Hits came out on CD and it sold more records than Michael Jackson, Irving Azoff comes to them and says, hey man, I can make you $50 million in 10 dates on a summer tour. Are you gonna not do that? You know, I don't give a fuck if you don't care about this person. If you can't stand him, just pretend. Go on stage and pretend. And Don said that after they did it enough times, that they didn't have to pretend so much. You know, he could. They actually kind of became okay friends. They never were big, good friends, but they were okay with each other. So, I mean, money has a lot to do with it, you know. And I think U2 sticks together because that's just kind of a magical thing. I mean, it's, Bono's a unique character, and he manages to keep it together, and they all love it.
You know, you talked about the band, and I remember the first time I heard the band, and I got a ride back from the university with a guy who was older than I and was more connected to the music community, and he knew songs that hadn't come out yet, and he had a new thing in his car which was called a tape deck that you could actually play tapes on. And he started playing this song. I was listening to the song, and it was all about, take a load off Annie, take a load for free. I said, what the hell? He said, who is this? He said, oh, this is the band. I said, I know, but who is it? He said, well, it's the band. Well, what do you mean, the band? He said, well, it's Bob Dylan's band. And I said, oh. Then I listened to it, and I found it to be a really interesting song, the way that they did it. And these guys, as you mentioned, and you talk about it in the book, this was a bar band that Dylan found. And they were all from different countries, different regions, different ages too. And they all came from different kind of music traditions. But they put together this stuff when they were on their own. You know, they put together these albums, 3 or 4 of them, I guess, that I thought were really, really interesting and really unique. And I really liked their music. But tell me about this group a little bit. What was, how could they do that?
Well, I mean, look, first off, you're right, they started out as a bar band. They worked with a guy named Ronnie Hawkins, and he was like Gene Vincent kind of guy. He was a Gene Vincent woman. And so they played that kind of stuff. And then Bob found them, and then they became Bob's backup band. And for Levon, that wasn't enough. I mean, Levon actually quit the Hawks because he just hated getting booed every day. And so he went off and literally went to work on an oil rig. He said, I'd rather do that than be booed every day. You know, and eventually, Bob had this accident, and the reasons behind that are, you know, fairly obvious. He told Robert Shelton from the New York Times that he'd been up for 3 days. Now, you're not up for 3 days just being a good old citizen. It's from amphetamine, you know, and that was Bob's kind of drug of choice. He wrote a book called Tarantula, which, if it still exists, is like 200 pages of just, I mean, you think Jack Kerouac is Stream of Consciousness, you haven't seen Stream of Consciousness. So anyway, so they eventually, Bob said to the band, come up to Woodstock. And they all rented, Robbie rented a house, or got a house on Albert's Grossman's property, and the rest of the band rented this funky little house, which they called Big Pink, in Saugerties, which is the next town over. And it had a garage, and they made a little recording studio. Literally a 2-track Studer tape recorder, 4 mics, a little simple mixer sat on top of Garth Hudson's organ, and that was it. And so they started playing, right? And they hadn't really, Robbie had written a few songs, but not really. But Bob said, well, I want to do that. So Albert Grossman said, well, look, you're not on the road to Dylan. You're not really recording. So the only way you can make money is sell publishing. Sell, you know, get people to cover your songs. And he says, everybody in the world wants to cover new Dylan songs. Yeah. The Byrds, Manfred Mann, all these people were just aching. So he said, make me a tape, a demo tape, of like 10 or 15 songs. And so they went in here, and this is what's known now as the basement tapes. And what happened was that Bob started teaching the band about the kind of mystical American music that came out of Kentucky and places like that. And the band started absorbing this stuff, and Robbie started thinking in a more poetic way of writing. And so first you get Bob's material, which is extraordinary, and for me it's the beginning of what we now call Americana, right? And then of course they sent that out, and the Byrds covered it, and the Burritos, and the, you know, and Manfred Mann, everybody started covering those songs. And then out of that, the band got to the point where they had 6, 7, 8 songs, and then Bob wrote a couple of sets of lyrics, one of which he gave to Richard Manuel, and one of which he gave to Rick Danko. And they made some songs out of those. And so then they had enough. And so Albert said, okay, well, I'll get you now a record deal. And so just out of that came Music from Big Pink. Yeah. And it's a really different record. If you think about what was really working at that point.
It was very different.
Was Cream, you know, it was people playing 10-minute guitar solos. Yeah. Or maybe the Jefferson Airplane, or something like that. And it was so different from that. There's not a solo that's more than 2 choruses in the whole record. And it just changed everything. I mean, I remember George Harrison coming to Woodstock kind of like on a pilgrimage. This is before the Beatles broke up. This was 68. And saying, I want to meet these guys. You know, what is this music?
Yeah, the band was really incredible. And, you know, a couple of those songs, Wheels on Fire, Tears of Rage, incredible songs. And these were Dylan songs. But they did them, and they did an incredible job. And just to tell, you know, I went to see the band, and I can't remember what year it was. You probably know, but they played at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, which was the place that you would go if you wanted to see something really great.
1969.
69. And so I went there, and I remember it because I drove my old '62 Volkswagen thing, and I picked up my friend Paul Virgin and my girlfriend at the time, Callie Swartz. And we went to the concert. And the concert was really great at the Guthrie, and the band was really on target. And so that we were leaving, as we were leaving, we were driving out of the place, and they had sang the song Across the Great Divide, Just Grab Your Girl and Take That Ride. Mm-hmm. It's a great song about the Great Divide. And so Callie said to Paul and I, she said, where is the Great Divide? And Paul said, well, it's in Colorado. And I said, well, I think it's where, we're from Minnesota, so what do we know? But I think it's where the Rockies split between East and West. I think that's the Great Divide. She said, well, where is it in Colorado? I said, well, I think it's, you know, west of Denver someplace. And she said, well, let's go there. and Paul said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, let's go there. That's what Callie said. And then so I look at Paul, and Paul said, well, we could go there, but we have to stop to get some beer. That's the way we thought in those days. I mean, it's kind of, the 60s, the 70s, dominated by politics. Jon, you've got a really interesting comment here. And you say that, you contend that politics follow culture and not the other way around. And I wondered what you meant by that.
So, I mean, this goes back to what I said at the very beginning. So, in 62, 63, the musicians were talking about civil rights, and I swear to God that John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were not talking about civil rights until they were forced to. Mm-hmm. In other words, in general, the culture leads the politics, and it does it all sorts of times. If you think about Woodstock, so we went to the Woodstock Festival, and we were living in Woodstock, right? And so the Woodstock Festival was not in Woodstock, it was in this town called Bethel. And I woke up on Saturday, we were supposed to play on Sunday night, which is the closing night of the festival. And I woke up on Saturday morning, and the New York Times had this big banner headline, like 300,000 people in a cornfield in the middle of and the New York Thruway is closed because people just left their cars on the side of the freeway. They couldn't move. Everything was just shut. And so I said, well, this sounds like a disaster. And they said, there's no food, there's no sanitation. It was like everything. So I called down to Michael Lang, who was the guy who was running it. I said, what's going on, man? And he says, no, everything's groovy. The hog farm is feeding people, and we've got all these doctors and nurses that are helping people off the acid trips, and don't worry about it. He says, there's only one problem. You can't get here from Woodstock. So he said, I'm sending a helicopter, and I had the biggest backyard of everybody. And so this helicopter lands in my backyard. We all get in the helicopter, and we take off. And like 20 minutes later, we come over this hill, and you look down below, and it's like a Cecil B. DeMille. It's like epic. I've never seen so many people in one place in my life. And it was like, what the fuck is going on here? And I think that had a profound effect on the country. I think the fact that all of a sudden, this sense that you were a hippie and you were alone, you might have felt alone in Iowa or, wherever you were living, or even in Minneapolis, you might have felt somewhat alone. But there were 300,000 of them in one place, all listening to Sly and the Family Stone. And it was like, holy cow. And so two things happened, one of which is that Madison Avenue grabbed that, they thought, oh my God. So we went from the Pepsi generation to Woodstock Nation, so Volkswagen starts selling that beat up VW bus, only it's the coolest thing in the world all of a sudden. And there's girls with flowers in their hair selling that bus, it got co-opted pretty quickly, but it still was real. It was still real. And there's a scene in the book where we're at a folk festival in Big Sur in 1967. And so it's Joan Baez's folk festival. It's called the Big Sur Folk Festival. And Joan Baez at that time was married to David Harris. And David Harris was the #1 draft resistor that the government wanted to put in jail. And he decided he was not going to go to Canada, he was not going to do anything, he was just going to go to jail. So he was scheduled to go to jail in like 2 or 3 months. And so he's there. We have this wonderful festival, and then they have a big dinner for all the artists. Joan asked David to give a speech. So here we are, David Crosby, Joni Mitchell, Stephen Stills, all these big artists there. And basically David Harris is saying, you gotta make a decision, man, just like me. You all gotta make a decision. Are you for this war or are you against it? And you gotta stand up. And David Crosby, who was a little stoned as usual, says, hey man, I do more good on the outside, writing songs and and doing that than I can going to jail. He says, that's just your choice. And it was like, holy cow, you're willing to say that? But that was true, and he probably did. I mean, he wrote, For Dead in Ohio, and it was a pretty powerful protest song, and so I don't know.
Well, the politics and the culture were so overlapping with each other, and they were also both evolving. I mean, culture was moving,
but they were beginning to split.
Culture was called the counterculture.
But they were beginning to split.
Right, and you could see that in the move. I mean, you could see that in the movement. You could see that in people. We've talked about it a little bit before.
Yeah.
we met. I've got a number of other things I wanted to ask, but I want to actually move it to the final, maybe the final question that I'll ask, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. There's a lot in your book that we haven't talked about. There's a lot more than the rock and roll phase, and it's a rich book in that regard, and I don't want to downplay any of that, and we can't really go through some of those aspects of it, but that one of the things that I found in your book is that you've got a firmer grasp, I think, totally than I do, over the kind of the pluses and minuses of the new technology. And I think you see not only the problems we see with some of the new technology, but also some possible or even probable solutions. And so, like, here's a big question for someone who's lived a big life. Can technology be harnessed today or tomorrow to rescue democracy from authoritarianism in America and elsewhere?
Well, the biggest problem with technology right now is, as you probably know, I wrote a book called Move Fast and Break Things,
Right.
which is about Facebook, Google, and Amazon. And the subtitle was How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy. And this was a book that I wrote in 2016, so that was a long time ago. And at that time, nobody really was thinking about that. But I thought recently that if Facebook had been around in 1955, we'd still have polio. And that, to me, is the biggest problem.
That's huge.
That's the biggest problem. There was a piece in the paper, in the Washington Post today, which said that the average viewer of Facebook is like 8 times more liable to not be vaccinated than the average viewer of even Fox News. You know? And so these people are incredibly irresponsible. They can spend millions of dollars, and I promise you they do, making sure that there's no porn on Facebook. And that's not an easy problem, because people are trying to upload porn all the time to Facebook. And you have to have artificial intelligence that can tell the difference between porn and some ethnographic film from New Guinea. It's not simple. And yet, they do it. There's no porn on Facebook. There's no porn on YouTube. And so these companies just only take care of things that they think might hurt their advertising. And porn is one of those things that would hurt their advertising. And at some point they eventually came to the conclusion at YouTube that having jihadist videos where people's heads get cut off hurts their advertising. When Procter & Gamble's found they had ads on the front of a jihadist video with somebody's head getting cut off. So they have no moral conscience whatsoever. They're libertarians, all of them. And libertarianism is the biggest problem. The reason that people think that liberty means I don't have to get a vaccination because I'm a free person is, you know, they never think of what that means to the rest of us who have to wear our masks just because these people refuse to get vaccinated. I mean, so, I mean, to me, it's the biggest problem we face. And I thought Biden was fabulous to say, you're killing people. He's right. And he shouldn't back down from that for 1 second. And these people, if you're online like I am and read something like Axios, you see that Facebook is spending millions of dollars in advertising to make you think that they're good citizens and that they want reform and everything, but they don't really want it at all. It's total nonsense.
Right.
Hey, there's one simple thing to do, too, by the way.
Please.
There's something called safe harbor. So these companies all have a liability exemption that you cannot sue Facebook for anything that's on Facebook. they claim they have no responsibility for anything that's on their platform, which is, of course, nonsense. They're taking lots of responsibility to get rid of the porn and the Janis videos. They're just not taking responsibility to get rid of the anti-vax stuff. I mean, Robert Kennedy is still on there. You know, I mean, he's putting out this nonsense. So, I mean, if you got rid of that and people could sue them, that would make a big difference. Because you noticed when Fox News started saying that the Dominion voting systems had switched all the votes from Trump to Biden, Dominion sued them for $1 billion. And within 2 days, they had a complete disclaimer up saying, we're sorry, we made a mistake, we didn't mean that. And even I saw a Chiron the other day of Trump giving a speech somewhere, and they put underneath it, this thing he's saying is not true. This is on Fox News, you know, about Dominion voting. So, I mean,
I see
you know, they can't sue Facebook because Facebook claims it has no liability. So that could be changed in an instant if a cretin named Ron Wyden, which was the senator from Oregon, who wrote that bill to give them the protection, changed his mind.
Maybe he should. I want to open it up to the audience.
Anybody have a question?
I'm sure there are questions that you may have.
Don't be shy.
Bert,
Why did
you get out of the music business?
Well, the band started to, this is tricky. You know, I said earlier it's hard to keep a band together, right? And so I was working for the band for 3 years, and then in the 4th year, cocaine arrived in 1972. And cocaine is a really pernicious drug because it makes people think they're much smarter than they actually are. You know, Levon used to call it philosopher's powder. You know, you think you're some brilliant person. And so it also makes people very aggressive. And then if you're up in the middle of the night and you know you're just jangly, you're clenching your teeth, then you decide you take 5 Valiums so you can go to sleep. And then the tour manager's job is to get people up to go to Chicago at 8 a.m. in the morning. And if you've taken 5 Valiums and you're not interested in getting up at 8 a.m. in the morning, and to have Levon chase me around the room with a Bowie knife was, you know, I thought, oh, life is too short, you know. And so I was privileged to then be hired by George Harrison to do the concert for Bangladesh, and we'd done this extraordinary show that we put together literally in 2 months, and it went from nobody knowing anything about what Bangladesh was to pretty much everybody knowing what it was. And it went off without a hiccup, except that Eric Clapton was complete stone junkie, and getting him on stage was like hell. And so I finished that, and then I get a call from the Rolling Stones, would you come to south of France and talk to us about tour managing the Exile on Main Street tour? And I went there, and I had a 1 o'clock meeting at Keith Richards' villa in Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat, and at 4 o'clock, Charlie Watts, the responsible member of the band, comes in, and 5, Mick shows up, and by 7:30, you know, Keith Richards is nowhere to be found. This is 7:30 at night, right? And Mick kept sending the butler up to get Keith out of bed, and eventually Keith shows up at 7:45, and he's just scratching the neck and just drinking, and just all the junkie alert signs were going off. And I thought to myself, it was hard enough just getting Eric Clapton on stage for one night, to go on a tour where you have to do this 5 nights a week. No way. And so I thought, there's got to be something I can do that's different. And so I just thought, and I was so naive, I thought, well, if I can produce 120 concerts in 5 years, I can make movies. Because in my thought was, in a music concert, when you're in front of 10,000 people, if something screws up, you're in big trouble. Fans are clapping, they want the thing to start, and you know, you're screwed. But if in a movie, if something screws up, you could say, oh, we'll come back tomorrow, we'll do it, we'll fix it. So that was how stupid I was. And then, so I came out here, and this friend of mine, Jay Cox, said, well, if you go out there, there's a kid named Marty Scorsese who edited Woodstock, and he loves music, and you should meet him. And so I came out here, and I called him up, and he came to my house, and he brought this script called Season of the Witch, and he said, I've been trying to make this for 4 years, and maybe you can help me make it. And so I took it, and I read it, and I liked it, and then I went down to William Morris and saw all his student films, and I thought they were great. And nobody had told me about OPM, other people's money. So somehow I thought, well, I'll just put my money in there, and I'll get a friend. And so we each put in $250,000, and we made Mean Streets, and thank God Marty made a great movie, and we got our money back. But wow. You know, it was just pure naive.
So that was a transition from, to answer Bert's question, from the music world to the movie world, and that was at least the second, or was that the third of your 6 careers?
That was the
second or the third. That was the second. Yes.
Back to music for a second. I'm curious. This is something I've thought of before, and I'm curious about your perspective. Much of the music you've been talking about from the early 1960s, Dylan, the Rolling Stones, Paul McCartney, they're still around. Nobody in 1962 had been around in 1902. What explains the fact that a 60-year arc has passed, and that music, in many respects, still has as much relevance and electricity today than it did then? Something that clearly had never happened before. People in 1962 were not listening to music from the 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe the 40s, and maybe the 50s. So that was it.
That's why the book is called The Magic Years. Something magical happened culturally where a convergence of the kind of electricity of rock and roll and the artistry of folk music came together. And for 10 years, maybe, just extraordinary stuff happened, and amazing music got made. And it just so happened that the business was in a boom time, and the executives who ran the business were incredibly artist-friendly. Mo Austin, Lenny Waronker, Ahmet Erdogan, Jack Holzman, all these people, all they wanted to do was support artists. They weren't even looking at it from a business point of view. I mean, if you think about Warner Brothers Records supporting Van Dyke Parks and Randy Newman, I mean, what the hell? You know, these weren't people who were going to sell 10 million records, but they had the Doobie Brothers, so they could do that. You know what I'm saying? So there was a lot of this, well, I'm going to give back. I'm going to do this. I mean, even John Hammond, who signed Bob Dylan, he didn't expect him to make a lot of money. He just thought it was worthy, you know? And so, I mean, I don't know exactly what was the secret sauce, but partially it was the sense of freedom, and partially it was the sense of you can try anything. We'll support it. And you know, fortunately for me, the exact same thing happened in the movie business. When I got into making movies with Marty in '73, the movie companies were in total disarray. I mean, Sound of Music had come out in like 1970, and then all the movie companies thought, well, we'll make musicals. And they made some of the worst musicals that have ever been made in the world. There's a musical where Lee Marvin and Clint Eastwood sing.
Oh my God.
I promise you. And it's one of the worst movies ever made. And they made a bunch of them, and they cost a lot of money, and all the studios. Fox went so bankrupt that it had to sell off the back lot to make Century City in order to make the payroll. And so all of a sudden, if you were a kid, a film student, and you could make a movie for $500,000, or make Easy Rider for $600,000, or make American Graffiti for $750,000, or Terry Malick's first film, you know, I mean, you could get inside the gates. They allowed you inside the studios. And that was like unique. And that didn't last that long. You know, it lasted till about George Lucas made Star Wars, and then everybody wanted to make Star Wars. And that was it. But Five Easy Pieces and Last Picture Show, and just, I mean, one after another, just extraordinary movies that were made, and none of them cost a lot of money. I mean, really. I mean, I don't think a single movie that BBS made cost more than $1 million. And that was this unique, cool time where everybody was kind of okay with that.
It's pretty cool. Any other questions?
I'm curious, John, in what domain do you see that happening today? I mean, in other words, the human spirit must express itself no matter what.
Well, you know,
Right.
it's interesting. I mean, I would say that the big cultural domain right now is no longer music. And I would argue that it's kind of dramatic TV, you know, TV series.
Yeah.
You know, and so on one level, I worry about it because, you know, when I think about that post 9/11 TV universe, I think of The Sopranos, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, Succession, you know, and all of them are united by one thing, which is they're about terrible people doing terrible things in a corrupt world. In other words, they're very dystopian and they're very nihilistic. And then I see Ted Lasso, and he's doing really well, and I think, well, wait a minute, maybe something is changing, you know, because that's the opposite of that. You know, it's about a decent person trying to be decent. And so, I don't know, I mean, Succession is still on, and it's still filled with horrible people doing horrible things, you know, and maybe, you know, maybe there's a battle for the soul of television as to what survives. But, you know, clearly the music business is not the core mover of the culture. You know, I noted that in last summer and last fall, in both Black Lives Matter and also in the run-up to the election and you know, getting people to vote, that LeBron James was much more vocal than Jay-Z was.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, okay, well, how is that happening? Well, LeBron James is kind of untouchable. Nobody's going to tell him just shut up and dribble, you know? And even Jay-Z probably feels he has to be careful with the powers that be, you know? And so, I don't know how this happens. And of course, I don't think when Bob Dylan went to Mississippi in 1963, he certainly didn't have anybody telling him, well, you can't do that or it'll ruin your career. He didn't have a career. He just did it because he felt like it. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just a quick question on SNCC.
SNCC.
When you were part of that, was that when Lewis was running it, or were you?
Yeah, Bob Moses, who just died
Just died.
2 days ago, and John Lewis were running.
Right.
So
And I will
before
tell you
Carmichael,
Before
that it was the most welcoming thing for young white students you can imagine. I mean, it was very multiracial.
So by the time it got to me, you couldn't be in SNCC.
Yeah, it changed.
No, Stokely Carmichael
You
took
couldn't.
over from John Lewis.
And
He kicked John Lewis and Bob Moses out. And then the first thing he did was say, okay, all the white kids got to get out.
so it was all about, you go over there and be SDS.
Yeah, and I had no interest in being in SDS.
It became black nationalist.
Yeah.
And so if you were a white person and I was in the civil rights, and then you had to kind of decide what you were going to do. I mean, I was in SDS, but that was the place to kind of to go.
Because I experienced it in music, so it just, it wasn't possible to be in a black band singing rhythm and blues anymore. So it just stopped.
Yeah. Although the oldest stuff,
Right.
a lot
At
of,
least
like the
Alicia
Del Vikings had,
Right.
a lot of the early ones coming out of World War II
Yeah.
were actually whites and blacks. Many of them had been in the service together.
You have, the best example of that is Booker T and the MGs out of Memphis. So
Yeah,
that,
totally.
that was great music and great stuff.
The Del Vikings.
Duck Gun.
So under Lewis, it just felt totally different.
Yeah, totally.
It was a new thing too.
Hey, listen, if anybody wants me to sign their book, I'm happy.
Yeah,
to do
well,
it.
I wanted to do that, and I wanted to actually, let's time out for a second. John, thanks for a great talk today. And I really found it interesting. I was glad to be able to be in conversation with you, and there's an awful lot to talk about.
It was great.
We do want to sell books here. We do want them signed. And I don't know if I'm violating protocol, but if you'd like to take your masks down and say hello or goodbye to everyone, or say hello to John, you're welcome to do that. But can you sign mine?
Yeah, of course.